what is the degree of inequality in South Asian country that is due to circumstances outside the control of the individuals. And so whether you're born in a special part of the country, whether your parents are of a certain ethnic group or of a certain education, whether you are a woman or a man, these are factors that you don't control, but they count a lot for your opportunities in life. Likewise, intergenerational mobility actually looks only at the position of your parents, how important it is where they are in terms of where you end up as a generation after. And interestingly, in South Asia, there is not much talk about inequality. There is much more talk about inequality when we travel to Latin America or even Sub-Saharan Africa. But in fact, this continent, the South Asia, this region, is the region with the highest inequality of opportunity.
The reforms of business entry or business licensing is perhaps the most common policy response to informality. It's really popular across the world. So, for example, between 2004 and 11, governments and stakeholders in about 54 countries introduced some new technology to simplify the business registration process. So the idea is that you can make business entry easier. Lots of firms that are informal will formalize, and then they will benefit from doing so, right? But most studies find that these business entry reforms have very modest impacts. For example, when informal firms in Sri Lanka were given information about registration process and even reimbursed the cost of registration in a randomized controlled trial, it was found that their registration rate did not really increase. And that's just one of many examples. Many trials like this have been done across the world.
Today we have this seminar, it's hybrid, it's also the webinar, Hidden Potential, Rethinking Informality in South Asia. So we all know that informality exists widespread in South Asia in many forms. You can see education, you can see health, you can see even economic opportunities. And when we see for example, we see the economy of Pakistan, you can see that, like, for example, there are certain different numbers on informal economy in Pakistan. Like, for example, over 36% of the economy, when we decompose in terms of GDP, that is informal. And when we see the labor market, that number goes very up. For example, labor force survey shows that 74% of the employed labor that is working in informal. And even we take all agriculture as the informal. And similarly, there are certain numbers. For example, there is a term NEET, not in education, not in employment, and not in skills. So 1/3 of our youth, aged from 15 to 25%, 24, sorry. So that is not part of education, not part of any training activities, and not part of employment. And when we take the female, this number goes to 60%. So a very potential, that working age group that is out of the labor market. So today we have two speakers, Dr. Maurizio Boslo and Dr. Siddharth Sharma. Dr. Siddharth Sharma is online. Dr. Boslo is here. Both are the lead economists in the Chief Economist Office in South Asia. Dr. Boslo have worked on economic policies and development, and at the World Bank he has worked for Europe, Central Asian countries, and he was leading the financial crisis of 2008-9 by negotiating with Latin American countries. Before joining the World Bank, he worked at OECD, ODI, London, and many other organizations. Similarly, Dr. Siddharth Sharma, his research includes productivity, labor market, innovation, and especially on regulatory environment, that how firms are affected through the regulatory framework. And Dr. Siddharth holds PhD from Yale University, and Dr. Boslo holds PhD from University of Bari. So Dr. Boslo, we warmly welcome you at PIDE. He started his travel 2 days earlier from Washington, and just today morning he reached Islamabad. So we highly delightful.
Can you hear me fine? Yes. Siddhartha, you can hear me as well. Yes, I hope so. Very good. I am not sure. We planned to speak at 15 minutes. Myself, 15 minutes. And Siddhartha, is that? I don't know the time that we have allocated.
We have some 90 to 100 minutes for this, so it's
okay. So
we can finish your presentation.
We have a bit more. Okay, so we
can
take a slide. Thank you very much. So, as you said, for me now it's midnight, and I had spent two nights on planes. So I hope I don't make sense, but thank you for the invitation. This is work that we have initiated almost 3 or 4 years ago, and it culminated. Okay. Yes, I have to speak close. And it culminated in a volume. You can see the cover in this first slide. And so I will present the first part, and then Siddhartha, my co-partner in crime for this, will present the second part. So let me then start with it. So as was said in the introduction, informality is a major development challenge issue in South Asia. From this graph, you can see that in terms of employment for in the non-agriculture, so excluding agriculture, informal workers are a very high share in the South Asia region. The first bar is the highest of the developing region, and it's about 75%. And nothing much has changed in the last decade, or if we have data also for the last 3 decades. And the most recent 3 decades have been decades of sustained growth. And so this growth has not made much of a dent in terms of the share of people that work in informal employment. The only region that has seen a reduction is Latin America, that you see there, the fourth group of countries. Indeed, in South Asia, as in some other regions, this share has even increased. And it's a development issue because informality is associated with at least three issues. First one is that it's associated with low earnings and low labor productivity, with high vulnerability. Informal workers tend to have unstable jobs and not protected against shock and other issues. And there's also, with high informality, a smaller tax base. The key word here, though, is associated. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that in the debate, which is vast on informality, there are two views. One that sees informality as causing the problem that I mentioned. Another view, opposite view, that sees informality more as a result of several problems. So these are the two views that we found in the literature. As I said, the vast literature. The first view is labeled here a choice view, where informality is really seen as hindrance to development. Informal firms, as workers, they choose to stay outside the purview of regulation and the government. They choose to remain small to avoid. They are tax dodgers. Okay, so that's the first view, and it may be because of intrinsically if they were to comply with all the regulation, they wouldn't be competitive. So they choose to not to stay invisible. Then there is the opposite view, that is a view of exclusion, not choice. This view is a view where informal firms are sort of victim of a dualistic economy, and the formal sector erects certain barriers. There are barriers to entry, and it's impossible for outsider to be part of the formal sector, which is benefiting a few insiders. So these two views clearly have opposite policy recommendation, policy implication. The first one is that we need to enforce more. We need to go after the evaders, the dodgers, and impose sanction and enforce more the regulation. And this will make sure that they choose right, and so they are not anymore informal firms and workers. The opposite policy recommendation for the opposite view is that we should liberalize. We should remove these barriers to entry. There should be fair competition, and that's the key. Now, what we do in this book with a series of studies is that we try to rethink this opposite view, and we try to find some more common ground. And part of this rethinking is because we realize that informality is not so homogeneous, but it's actually composed of different types of firms and workers, and to really be able to resolve the problem is resolving both issues in the formal and the informal segment of the economy. So, in more detailed view, in more detailed words, this is volume that we will talk to you today as this sort of rethink. First, I already mentioned there's a lot of heterogeneity in the informal sector, and so there could be coexistence of both choice and exclusion. And if you were to go with only one view, you will not resolve the full problem. The second area that we give quite a bit of rethinking is looking at an important new development, technological development, which is the digital economy. We study in this book. What happened? Yes. Okay. So the second way of rethinking informality is considering this new technology, the digital economy, and in particular whether e-commerce could help, and what is the impact of e-commerce on informality. And we'll talk more about this, but also what other intervention can be done to support informality. And the last part of the book looks at the issue that I mentioned, the vulnerability. How can we support informal workers? If there are low taxes, the normal answer is that the revenues are low. There's not much money to go around. But even if we add magically a larger revenue, there are no institutions set up to support informal workers. And so the social protection, the social assistance, as we will show, are not very well developed. And so there's a need of thinking even before the revenues will be larger, what can be done? Okay, so these are the three areas that we will discuss. This is a table of contents of the book, which, as I said, is a result of the contribution from several researchers. Here, the various chapters are grouped in three parts. The first one that looks at determinants of informality. The second one that looks at these digital technology and complementary intervention, and the last one that looks at vulnerability. We will try to summarize in this presentation what comes out of all these studies into four main messages. Okay, the first one is an empirical finding, and it basically, when you look at the structure of this economy, you find that most of informality is made up of firms that are really outside, that they don't have even to formalize, they don't have to comply to the legislation regulation because they are too small. And in other words, they are not choosing to dodge the regulation. They don't even have to comply because they're small. So there is a problem that is not enforcement problem. The second main message that comes up is that while there have been many attempts to facilitate the entry to the formal segment, this has not worked very well. And the main channel that has been attempted was to simplify the licensing systems, the licensing process, and thinking that this was the largest barrier, but it doesn't seem to have worked very much. Firms tend to formalize briefly when you help them with all the paperwork, and even when you give them some additional money, but normally they don't remain formal after that. We will look at this in more detail. So what needs to be done is really to remove major inefficiency, and that requires much deeper general equilibrium needed type of reforms, and we'll discuss that. So the policy design is complex. The third message is that, okay, so even if we were able to manage doing all these changes, there will be large impact, but there will still be a big tail of very small firms that we need to do something about their productivity, how to help them. And that's where we discuss these examples of the digital economy and the complementary intervention. And finally, the last message is again on vulnerability. As I said a moment ago, what can be done with the current low revenues? How can we design a better social protection and social assistance program, and again, recognizing the heterogeneity of firms and informal workers, we can find a way of getting their saving much more towards to protect them against risk than in the current system. So those are the four messages. Let me, before I talk about the first in some details, and then I pass it to Siddhartha, I would like to present briefly the conceptual framework that we use to think of informality, and it helps us put together all the pieces in the end. Okay, so the framework that we use borrows heavily from recent research by Ravi Kambur and Gabriele Ulicea, which have worked quite a bit on this field. And it starts, the framework starts with thinking about a hypothetical economy with no government intervention and no regulation. This economy has firms that produce an homogeneous good with labor inputs and other inputs. And all the firms have the same production function with decreasing returns to scale. This is important. And the only difference among the firms is the level of productivity, or TFP, total factor productivity. Okay, with these conditions, in this economy, there will be a natural distribution of size. Some firms will be small, optimally small. Some firms will be medium, optimally medium, and some firms will be large, optimally large. It won't be that all the resources go to one, the most productive firm. Why not? Because of decreasing returns to scale. So there are two forces: the higher productivity that pull resources into it, but the decreasing returns to scale, so that this cannot become a giant one single firm. So in this economy, there will be this distribution of sizes according to TFP, and labor will be allocated optimally, and output will be maximized. Enter the scene the government. Okay, and the government to enter the scene with a size-related intervention, which is as follows: firms above size Q will have to pay, get a license to operate. So there will be an entry cost, and they will have to pay labor taxes to finance social protection, to finance their pension or whatever. Okay, these are the two regulations: an entry cost and a labor tax. But there's one more element in this new situation, and that is the government cannot enforce perfectly these two regulations. And so it can enforce more easily the larger the firm is, because it's more visible, it's easier to go and inspect. Are you paying did you have a license? Are you paying the labor taxes, etc.? So because of this imperfect enforcement, and because the advantages of being formal increases with size, so with larger size you have more access to credit, you have more access to government procurement, etc. What happens is that there is an increasing, we can draw this increasing line, the line that you see in this graph, upward sloping, which relates the benefit of formality with the size of the informality. So on the vertical axis, you have this benefit, net benefit, the benefit of being formal, minus the cost of being formal, which is the labor taxes. And on the horizontal axis, you have the size of the firm. And this is an upwards sloping curve. Okay, so this is the setting. At that moment, when you have this size-related intervention, firms split in four groups. Above R, above the size R, all firms benefit from informality, they will comply to it, and they're all formal. So above R, okay? Which is noted, it's slightly above level Q, and you will figure out why in a moment. Below Q, firms don't have to comply with the regulation. The regulation starts at Q. So if you're optimally smaller than Q, you don't have to do anything. And so we can call these firms informal, but in fact they are outside. So they are not informal in the sense that they are dodging the regulation. They just don't have to apply the regulation, so they are outside. Now, what most economists worry about is between Q and R. That's where you have two more groups of firm. One that is called, we can label them, Ravi Campbell label them the evaders. These are firms that are close to R, where they're almost, the benefit to be formal is almost there, but not yet. And they decide to not formalize and evade the taxation and the risk to be caught, since they are a little bit smaller, is low. So those are the ones that really evade. And the other one, the last group is the one close to Q, which may choose, these are the avoiders, they may choose to not expand at their optimal level above Q but below R, because they say, well, if I stay just a little smaller, I don't have to comply with anything, and so it's better. So I repeat, there are a group that is formal, always formal, above R, a group of avoiders below Q, and then these two that most of the literature talks about, the evaders and avoiders. Okay, but there have to be different policies for all of these parts. Okay, so that's an important thing that I want you to keep in mind. So I go back now quickly to the first message, and then I'll pass it to Siddharth. The first message was about so when we look around, what type of firms, or do we find a lot of avoiders, a lot of evaders, or what? And the answer is not simple, because you would need a really a general equilibrium model to see what happens when you change some regulation. So it's not easy to do this calculation, but when we do look at them and the literature, the one clear finding is that the majority of firms are outsiders. So they are too small. They don't have to comply with any regulations because of their size, and they're not. And very few. In fact, there's this study by Chatterjee and Kambor that shows that very few are evaders or avoiders. But again, the majority. And here you have three countries. There's no Pakistan, but I believe Pakistan would be similar. So that's an important find. We need to do. We can worry about the avoiders and the evaders, but we definitely have to also worry about these small firms and large share of them which are at the outside. Then one more stylized fact that is related to the upward sloping benefit of formalization comes from this graph that shows you for two groups of firms a series of potential issues, such as able to get a bank account, sell to the government, qualification for government program, able to export, etc., etc. And most of these benefits are larger for firms that are 5 employees or more, the light blue. And for smaller firms, they also benefit, but less. So that's the differential that I will show you. The larger size you are, the more you benefit from this. So there's, again, evidence that the framework that we use is useful. And finally, I was saying that there is a lot of overlapping, of intermingling between formal and informal firms and employment. And these graphs show you exactly that. In the left-hand side graph, you have a kernel function, which looks at as the productivity value added of labor, value added per worker on the horizontal axis. And then you have several bell curves for different type of firms: formal firms, informal, with one worker, and slightly bigger ones. And indeed, if you look at the means, they are the formal. One of the things that I started from, the formal firms are more productive, but it's only the means or the top of the bell curve, right? but the bell curve overlap for a lot. So we can find informal firms that are as productive as formal or vice versa. Likewise, in terms of earning, on the right-hand side, you have workers ordered according to their level of income. So you have 100 beams. The first beam is the 1% lowest earning, and so on and so forth until the 100, which is the highest earning. And then you have two curves, one for workers that are informal and the other one that workers are formal. Obviously, for at least 50% bottom earners, you see that the most of the workers, the percentages are very high for the informal. But when we move to 70th percentile and above, then you begin to have a lot of formal and informal together to coexist. Okay, so it's not that informal is only the poorest and formal only the richest. There is all these heterogeneity going on. So this is where I stop, and I give the floor to Siddharth, who, by the way, is actually today is his birthday. Not only is midnight for him in Washington and he's accompanying us, but it's also his birthday. So thank you, Siddharth. The floor is yours.
Happy birthday. Hello, everybody say happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, it is indeed my birthday. So it's a great pleasure to present. I'm sorry I could not be there in person. So let me start. So Maurizio, just discussed this really striking feature about informality in South Asia, that most informal firms in South Asia are, what we call outsiders, right, in our framework. So there are firms that are inherently or naturally small, and they're not staying small to escape regulations. What does this mean for policy reform and the impact of policies to address informality? It means that business licensing reforms have limited impacts on firms. Now, reforms of business entry or business licensing is perhaps the most common policy response to informality. It's really popular across the world. So, for example, between 2004 and 11, governments and stakeholders in about 54 countries introduced some new technology to simplify the business registration process. So the idea is that you can make business entry easier. Lots of firms that are informal will formalize, and then they will benefit from doing so, right? But most studies find that these business entry reforms have very modest impacts. For example, when informal firms in Sri Lanka were given information about registration process and even reimbursed the cost of registration in a randomized controlled trial, it was found that their registration rate did not really increase. And that's just one of many examples. Many trials like this have been done across the world. Even a large-scale reform, such as one in Mexico, that reduced the number of days that it takes to start a business from 30 to 1, right? So it was a big reform. And even that, it only increased business registration by 5%, which is a fairly modest impact. Also, when informal firms do register after these reforms, the firms that do register do not seem to experience major improvements in business performance. And this goes back to this idea that Maurizio was discussing, that if a firm is inherently small for other reasons, it has other constraints and not necessarily just about business licensing, then just formalizing is not going to give it a lot of returns, right? And that seems to be borne out in most of these studies. But that being said, there are some evidence gaps here, and we don't know the full answer about what happens when business licensing is really liberalized. We don't know the indirect effects of these reforms, and there may be hidden entry barriers that are not being addressed by these reforms. In other words, it may still be the case that it's difficult for firms in the informal sector to formalize and grow, but the barriers are not in the licensing laws, but somewhere else. Now, Indeed, there is now evidence that more deep reforms to economic distortions can have major indirect impacts on the informal sector. So what do I mean by this? So one of the studies in our volume looks at tries to estimate what are de facto entry barriers and resource allocations in the Indian manufacturing sector using data from the Indian manufacturing sector. And it estimates a general equilibrium model. And then it tries to see what is the impact of reducing these real barriers to entry and distortions on informality. Well, what do we mean by distortions here? So again, thinking back to the framework that Maurizio discussed, there were two distortions there. First, there was an entry cost, right, which only some firms had to pay, not all the firms. So the distortion is that the cost is not for everyone, but only for a few. The second distortion was the tax. In a way, a tax is a distortion because it is in the sense that in that framework it applied only to some firms, not all equally, and so it changed the price of labor, and so it's a distortion because it's changing the price of inputs, and then that affects how resources are allocated across firms. So anyway, so in a word, what does this paper find? Using data, it backs out what must be the real entry cost in Indian manufacturing and what must be the overall distortion in the economy. And what it finds is that the current size of India's informal sector, about half of that can actually be explained by these entry barriers and distortions. And so in an experiment that this model does, right, if say the benchmark economy, which is taken to be the US economy, if that economy was given the level of entry costs and distortions that exist in India, then informality there would rise to 54%. And that's more than halfway to what is the actual level of informality in India, which is about 85% in terms of the number of employment firms. So this is what we mean by the statement that de facto entry barriers and distortions can explain more than half the current size of India's informal sector. And this may be the case in other South Asian countries as well. So what really happens here is that when you remove these distortions, it allows more productive firms to grow and innovate. And this tends to increase the total factor productivity in the economy. So in the chart in the right, what you see is estimates of how much total factor productivity you can increase by reforming entry barriers and removing distortions. And so India, it's the gain is quite high. In Pakistan, it's even higher. In Bangladesh, even higher. So major TFP gains from removing distortions, and they have an indirect effect on informality, because what happens is that when the most productive firms grow, then less productive firms, whether they are informal or formal, they are driven out of business, and so overall efficiency improves. So while it is true that these reforms can have large indirect effects on the informal sector, it's not easy to identify the specific causes of distortions, nor is it easy to implement reforms that can address these barriers. So first of all, our knowledge of what is driving these entry costs or distortions is limited. In the model that I just described to you, the entry cost and distortion was estimated from the data. It was inferred from the data. But we don't know from the model and from the data what is the real factor behind that entry cost or these distortions that we observe in firm level data, right? So that's one challenge in implementing any reform based on this. Second is that studies suggest that no single source of distortion or no single reform on its own is big enough to be transformative if you remove it. So, for example, one of the papers in our volume looks at the effect of the value-added tax. So the VAT is supposed to reduce the distortion that is caused by double taxation along the value chain that you see in a sales tax. So when you remove a sales tax by a VAT, you should see a reduction in distortions and an improvement in total factor productivity. And that does happen in this paper. They estimate that in the case of one Indian state, and they find that with the VAT, the total output of the formal sector and the informal sector would increase. But again, the effect on the informal sector is not transformative. This seems like this is just one of many possible causes. The third issue is that even if you could identify the source of the distortion and you could implement a reform, actually implementing it meaningfully is difficult because of political economic constraints. There are often vested interests or other barriers to actually implementing such reforms. Similarly, along these lines, one of the papers in the volume also finds that the relationship between informality and the impact of changes in the tax designs may be limited. So there is this hypothesis that a large informal sector constrains tax policies, and that's because if the informal sector is a close substitute to the formal sector, then if you increase tax rates, then sales will either be diverted to the informal sector, or informal firms will capture market share from the formal sector. Right? So this again goes back to the idea that informal firms are kind of hiding from regulations to get a competitive edge over formal firms. What this paper finds, it exploits a natural experiment, which is that the VAT tax rate varies across very small, very narrowly defined product categories in India. And so it uses these variations and changes in these rates to estimate the elasticity of sales of reported sales to the tax rate. And what it finds is that unlike what this hypothesis would suggest, there isn't a very strong relationship between the sales tax, the rate of the tax rate, and its impact on reported sales, and that doesn't seem to depend on the size of informality. So what this chart here on the right shows is that the estimated elasticity of sales to the tax rate doesn't really vary that much across sectors that have different levels of informality. We would have expected that actually sales would be more elastic where there is more informality because there's more diversion there, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So again, it supports this view that actually most informal firms are just very small and they're not competing directly with formal firms. Next, we think about, besides reforms, business licensing reforms and broader reforms, we make the case that interventions that enhance the productivity of the informal sector, that are directly about improving productivity of firms or workers, are also really important. And here, really, a promising pathway for informal firms is perhaps offered by digital platforms like e-commerce platforms. So the idea is that an outsider-type informal firm may find it difficult to access markets because there are high upfront costs of marketing, warehousing, and transportation. So these are, in a way, these are de facto entry barriers. A small firm cannot really, for them, these costs are prohibitively high. Now, how does an e-commerce platform help here? So it can actually reduce these de facto barriers to market access for small firms. That's because platforms provide infrastructure at a low cost, but they also reduce transactions costs. These costs are about market search, transportation, tracking, verification. All these things require investments or fixed investments that may be very expensive for a small firm to do. So in a way, platform is bringing all this down. Right? Being on a platform can also get you access to information on new technologies, on business practices. It generates data that can allow firms to track their revenues, their costs, and their performance indicators. And these data can also be used to build creditworthiness, right, to improve access to finance. So finally, with all these benefits possible, right, this may also increase the incentives of firm to formalize. So the idea here is that a digital platform may actually make it worth the while of firms to formalize, because it increases their access to market, and then they have an incentive to grow. So now, e-commerce platforms are not the only type of digital intervention that may work in the same way. In South Asia, these platforms are growing in other informal sectors, such as ride-hailing and domestic work. And how does this work? So one of the papers in this, in our book, looks at the impact of joining an e-commerce platform on formal and informal firms. And what it finds is that both formal and informal firms experience similar growth in sales and in market penetration after joining an e-commerce platform. And that's promising because it suggests that an informal firm is equally likely to benefit from joining a digital platform as a formal firm. So the chart here is showing the evolution of monthly revenue on an e-commerce platform. And it's comparing informal firms on the platform to formal firms on the platform. And so the dark blue is informal and the light is formal. What you see here, first of all, is that even though informal firms are smaller, their total sales are less. Their revenue per worker on the platform is actually higher than that of formal firms. So that's the first thing that suggests that these e-commerce platforms may be especially valuable for informal firms. Secondly, you see here the trend over time. As the months on the platform increase, there is an increase in revenue. And this happens for both formal and informal firms. So both types of firms are experiencing expansion in sales. This chart now does the same thing, but now you're looking at the number of zip codes in which they're selling. And you see the same thing, that for both formal and informal firms, the number of distinct markets that they're selling in is increasing over time. So firms do seem to benefit this way from joining an e-commerce platform. But it also seems like these platforms are not the solution for all informal firms. As Maurizio was just discussing, informal firms are very heterogeneous. And you see that even when you look at the impact of platforms. So the first issue is that the firms on this platform have a low survival rate. So of the firms that join, about 2 years later, only 50% are still on the platform. And this is true for both formal and informal firms, but more so for informal firms. The second issue is that informal firms on the platform are actually a selective group of informal firms. They are not the typical informal firm. So what do I mean by that? So in this table, the columns on the left are showing you the characteristics of informal firms in the e-commerce platform. And on the right, you see data from a representative household survey in India, where this e-commerce platform is. And this survey is telling you what a typical household enterprise looks like. So that includes those that are on the platform, but also many that are not. So that's the general population of informal firms. And what you see is that firms on the platform are more likely to have a female manager or than a typical informal firm. They have a younger manager, and most strikingly, the people running these informal firms on a platform are much more educated than the typical informal entrepreneur. So it looks like the benefits of e-commerce platforms or access to e-commerce platforms for some reason are limited to a selective set of informal firms, which are younger and more educated. Our last main message is about addressing vulnerability in the informal sector. And the first point we make is that the informal sector is not just less productive than the formal sector with lower wages, so it has lower labor productivity. It's also more vulnerable. So what do we mean by this? For example, one of the papers here looks at the impact of the COVID crisis on informal workers in India. And what we find is that informal workers were about 6% more likely to lose their job than a formal worker, even in the same location and in the same industry. So this suggests that there is something about being in an informal job that makes you more exposed to economic shocks. The chart here is based on panel data regressions, and what you see here is that basically you're seeing that the probability of losing your job is about 6% more higher if you are an informal worker compared to being a formal worker. Even the self-employed had a higher probability of job loss than formal workers, but not so much higher than informal workers. Now, being exposed to these shocks is particularly damaging to informal workers because they don't have access to social insurance programs that can help cover risks like job loss or illness, injury, or old age. Right? And the chart here shows the coverage of social protection, the safety net, in South Asian countries compared to the world and a few other regions. And what you see here, the bars in the red, show that South Asia is not so far behind when it comes to the coverage of social assistance programs, like cash transfers or anti-poverty programs. It's when it comes to social insurance programs, those that deal with risks, that's where South Asia is behind the rest of the world. And even there, the South Asia's numbers are really pulled up sometimes by a few countries like India and in the typical country, it still has very poor coverage. So the point we make is that even in the informal sector, there's a lot of heterogeneity in incomes and savings capacity among informal workers, and this calls for a multifaceted approach to addressing this problem of low coverage of safety net. So the first element of the strategy to cover the informal sector better is to start from the bottom. So by this we mean that for the very poor, there already exist non-contributory social insurance schemes, typically targeted at the elderly. So we're talking about non-contributory pensions schemes that are targeted at the very poor, and they exist in almost all South Asian countries. So what we need to think about is how can we expand the coverage and benefit levels of such programs. And one of the studies in this book analyzes this and tries to look at different scenarios and what it would imply for the government budget. And what it finds is that it's possible, right? So increase the coverage in a modest way and to increase the benefit levels so that the beneficiaries at least reach a certain minimum level of income coverage. But it's going to be expensive. So, and one reason is that over time, the populations will age. And that alone, even if you don't expand coverage or benefit level, will make these programs 3 times as expensive as they are right now. And then as you start to see here in this chart, as you start to expand benefit levels and coverage, the costs do go up. So there's a need to determine what is affordable and set benefit levels and eligibility accordingly. But we can see from this that is not going to be enough, and other things will be needed to complement it. And there's this issue we saw in some of the facts that Maurizio was showing, that there is this kind of missing middle in the informal sector, meaning that not all workers in the informal sector are really poor. Right? They're somewhere in the middle, and they don't get covered by these non-contributory schemes. So one way to cover this missing middle is to think about extending programs that are contributory and for the formal sector into the informal sector. And the experience of other countries shows that it doesn't always work. It's hard, but when it does work, it's because the program is kind of very simply designed, and it tailors itself to the needs of the informal sector. The third part of this approach to cover the informal sector is to think about how to unlock the savings in the informal sector itself. So again, if you think about the heterogeneity in the informal sector, there is a segment there that has the capacity to save for retirement or shocks. So this analysis is from Pakistan, data from Pakistan, and what it says is that in 2001, about 20% of Pakistani households had accumulated wealth equivalent to about 5 years of consumption. So this could pay for 5 years of consumption by age 65. In 2018, the share of age 65 of 65-year-olds who had savings enough to pay for 5 years of consumption, the share had gone up from 20 to 35%. So there is a segment in the informal sector that has savings capacity. Right? But the same study finds that much of the savings in Pakistan was locked up in real estate. It's not very liquid. And so this suggests that many households lack access to suitable savings instruments. And suitably designed programs could help the segment in the informal sector who actually have some capacity to save for retirement, but lack access to suitable financial instruments or knowledge, or they have limited incentives to save. So with that, I'll conclude. It's worth emphasizing that our starting point was that even after 3 decades of sustained growth, informality is still pervasive in South Asia. And ignoring its complex causes and consequences means you're ignoring a central development issue in South Asia and in other developing countries. Our main message is that there is a need to shift the policy focus away from just reducing informality, because it's a hindrance to the rest of the economy, and to shift this focus towards removing the constraints on the informal sector. And only then is it possible to improve the lives of informal workers and create growth opportunities for informal firms. Efforts to support firms and workers in the informal sector should consider the heterogeneity of the informal sector. It's informal, across different sectors of the economy, by income, by skill levels, and by ability to save, as we just saw. And recognizing the heterogeneity of the informal sector and adapting policy interventions to different cases is important, not just when you're thinking about how to grow the informal sector, grow productivity in the informal sector, but also when the aim is to build resilience. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is Nasser from PIDE. So basically, when we talk about the informality and their needs, one question that when we were surveying in the migrants, Mahon in Rawalpindi and other areas of Islamabad, they don't have any desire to grow. That's the big issue. It's not about the regulation. It's not about the cut-off point where they are really looking for to jump from the informal to the formal sector. They are happy with the existing structure where they are working. This is the one part of the question. The second part is the use of the technology. It's not about that they are not aware that the recent technologies, someone has to told them that they have to use it, but are finding that I already shared a study over there that they are using the technology as per their need. The one example could be like this is the mobile banking. We did survey in the street, and almost all were using this like a latest financial instrument to make business transactions. They are well aware about the changing need of the technology, and they are adopting as per their needs. So it's not about that the informal sector is totally ignored from these aspects. So these are the few things that we really have to think, because this informality, as you said in the last slide, despite the last 3 decades when there is impressive growth, informality remains there. I think it will remain there because it's a natural concept. You cannot ignore this aspect of informality. The idea is how to facilitate. And this social protection, again, they are getting so many benefit in terms of other things. And the last, the point that really I want to make is whether they are looking for the formal sector in terms of any financial support to expand their business. The answer again is like no. Maybe I'm very strong in terms of asking no, because they have a very kind of informal setting to finance their businesses. Thank you.
Hello. So my question to you is, since you mentioned that since the last decade we experienced growth, and despite that amount of growth, we're still not able to remove informality. The thing is, for countries like Pakistan, where we have this influx of refugees and often at times we get IDPs, the internally displaced persons, given such a scenario, I mean, do you think reducing informality could be, is it achievable or possible in that way? Or like, just as you in the presentation you mentioned, lifting up the constraints of the informal sector, because such an influx of people, is adding to firms creation, and then adding more to the informal labor market as well.
We can start with these 2 questions, or Siddharth, maybe I can start. Maybe I can touch upon something initially, and then you complement. I think you may have some views about technology adoption that was mentioned there. But okay, in terms of the first question, which you mentioned, that it seems that a lot of informal workers or firms are happy about where they are and they don't have any aspirations. So that's an interesting observation. And we actually did another study that maybe I should come again next time and present that on inequality of opportunity and intergenerational mobility. What I mean by that is that we have looked at what is the degree of inequality in South Asian country that is due to circumstances outside the control of the individuals. And so whether you are born in a special part of the country, whether your parents are of a certain ethnic group or of a certain education, whether you are a woman or a man, these are factors that you don't control, but they count a lot for your opportunities in life. Likewise, intergenerational mobility actually looks only at the position of your parents, how important is where they are in terms of where you end up as a generation after. And interestingly, in South Asia, there is not much talk about inequality. There is much more talk about inequality when we travel to Latin America or even Sub-Saharan Africa. But in fact, this continent, the South Asia, this region, is the region with the highest inequality of opportunity. So it's the region where has most unfair inequality. So I'm not saying that this may be the reason why some people don't have aspiration to grow, but it may be part of the reason. And there is discussion on how to go about that. Some are controversial. There's a lot of, for example, in terms of gender or ethnic group, there is affirmative action that is a policy that has been applied, and somehow, in some cases, it works. There's a inheritance law that breaks the generational transmission of benefits. In terms of the firms space, there's competition, if you wish. And there are even some studies that we don't look at them in terms of inequality of opportunity for firms again. So it may be that people don't have aspiration because they know they even if they had, they will be crushed, these aspirations. So that's part of the answer. In terms of technology adoption, maybe I'll let you speak, and also about the immigration, which what you pointed out. Siddharth, you wanna?
Yeah, and really interesting issue of technology adoption and do informal firms want that, and is that the answer? So, the evidence on technology adoption is still quite limited, and one of the questions seems to be that are some of these technologies which we think are the answers, do they actually have this make sense for firms? Are their costs worth the benefits? And that came up when we were talking about e-commerce platforms. And as you saw, firms that are on the platform, many of them informal firms, do seem to experience some increase in revenue, and they seem to gain from it. But then they're not the typical informal firm. So there is an issue around, is technology appropriate for everyone? So, and that may be the reason why we get the sense that informal firms are not interested or know about it, but are not interested in adopting. Right? So we are doing some work in Bangladesh in the leather goods sector with really small firms. Many of them are informal, and the case there is that there is a new, more energy efficient motor that's available in the market, and it could lead to substantial energy savings in these farms. And it's quite easy to use. It doesn't involve any major reskilling or anything in your workforce, but the adoption rate is quite low. And in this study, we focus on information. So these firms are somewhat aware of the technology, but they still don't know exactly how much it can benefit them, and they lack access to reliable information. So that's that could be one of these issues. Yeah. On migration, I think that's related to this issue of access to markets. So many of these firms, as we discussed, do seem to benefit when they are able to gain access to some technology that makes it easier to sell to a bigger market, and then they can expand. And that's often a constraint on these firms. And if they have access to markets, then growth and expanding employment will be less of an issue. So that's another very important aspect here. I see that there are some more hands raised
from online participants. Dr. Alia, please kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mario and Siddharth, for a very comprehensive exposition of the informal sector economy and from the point of view of enterprises and workers. I'm a retired professor of economics from Quaid-e-Azam University, and I've worked a lot on the informal economy. I want to raise two issues. Pakistan has repeatedly tried to develop policies for SMEs, which really come under the fold of the informal economy debate. And the process has not really been very fruitful. And my question is that have you also looked, or this volume has also looked into differentiated regulatory legislative frameworks for the informal economy? Because if we try to juxtapose the formal economy regulatory frameworks, then it doesn't work. And second, I want to ask about the regularity of the surveys that are conducted to map the informal economy. The government of Pakistan does not conduct a regular survey through its Pakistan Bureau of Statistics on enterprises, on MSMEs, I should say. So unless that happens, policy cannot really get informed, and nor can legislation. So I want your take on both of these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Siddharth and Maurizio, first and foremost, you almost make me miss the World Bank, even after 9 years when I was hearing this, because the access to data and very good work. And thank you, Nadeem Saab, for inviting these people. We are doing some work in the sort of MSME and SME region, partly looking at performances. But we are more concerned with the formal side, partly because we're working for a private sector client. My questions to you are, number one, is there a data set in all the data that you have collected which actually shows that there could be a jump after a certain size from informality to formality for reasons of efficiency or for other reasons, etc.? Second, is there solid data on the investment rate of the 65 plus segment, and is there any work done already in your in the World Bank on how this can drive pension funds and a private insurance market in Pakistan? You might know, Maurizio, that the finance minister only recently announced that she's going to put the State Life, one of the largest cash cows, on the chopping block. The third question, I'm sorry, I just have one more. When you are basically, one of the things you do allude to is starting to target the complexity and cost and associated rents by targeting and taking care of these people in the informal sector who are there and are more exposed to shocks, while the whole world is moving towards more and more universal basic income. And has there been any study done to compare all these very complicated, targeted, income transfer mechanisms like BISP, etc., with just leaving choices to people and actually starting to study the choices by actually putting a UBI in place, whether it be even in a state or in a union council or a province, etc. And so before I leave, thank you for allowing me the time to ask these questions. But also, I think that the reason, by the way, Siddharth and Maurizio, you asked about, we never hear about, opportunity and people trying to ask about, that they don't get equity or equality of opportunity, is because we have 60 years of history now. I can vouch for that, of telling people that, you're poor, you're poor. There's a whole debate on poverty is overwhelming in South Asia. I've worked in other regions in ECA and also in East Asia, and I've always found that in MENA that, in the World Bank, that this debate only happens with the severity that it does in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, and then obviously to its satellite nations. Thank you.
I'm going to argue that informality is a red herring. And we spent a lot of time discussing it without really understanding the issue. There's informality in the US as well. If I remember Vito Tanzi's first work on this, and if I remember even the recent IMF report, US has about 25% of its economy as informal. And you can see outside the World Bank building, there are tons of these, lots of these street vendors who are, if anything, informal. The second thing is that we are now coming full circle. We are the Uber economy, or the what do you call it, share economy, is also an informal economy. They're informalizing the formal sector. So I think maybe there's a Kuznets kind of curve here, that you need informality at the beginning of development, and then you end up being informal at a later stage of development too. So maybe we are just chasing informality because we don't understand the fact. We economists, as Friedman used to say, if you know how to make money, go and make money. But we economists don't know how to make money, so we think informality is some kind of a sin. But all informality is an entrepreneur trying to break into the market. And yes, some break in, very few, others don't break in. Those who break in, like Steve Jobs, etc., they started off informally in the garage and they made it. Amazon started off in the basement and made it. But many didn't, and they struggled for a long time, then gave up or remained at a very low level. So maybe it's just that. I don't see how social protection can help. I really don't see how social protection can help. I think that's kind of attacking the problem the wrong way. Basically, are you recommending that we take away the risks of informality? The risks of, for example, if Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos had been given social protection and said, guys, it doesn't matter if you fail, but they have made it. I think we really need to understand if it's a startup problem, if it's a street vending. We've tried to do street vending in Pakistan. We've tried street vending in Pakistan. We've done a study on it. The problem is the government. We've done a study on regulation, and we've estimated the cost of regulation is huge. Poor people are scared of regulation, and many of them die because of regulation. So on the one hand, we give them a lot of regulation. On the other hand, we recommend social protection. I think we need to get our own act together, we economists. What are we recommending? On the one side, we recommend a lot of regulation. On the other side, we recommend a lot of social protection. And the government is a limited kitty, and the government ends up, in trouble. Then the IMF comes along and says, hey, please regulate more and get rid of social protection, or increase social protection. So I think somehow, is anybody seeing the forest for the trees?
Okay, very good. It's getting interesting. So that's great. That's why we came to discuss with you. Siddharth, you want to start? I started. I want to. Since I started earlier and I chose, maybe you want to start and you leave me the difficult one. What do you want to do?
Sure, Maurizio. I can take a few. Okay. First of all, I want to thank for all the great questions. It's always good to see that the audience is asking all these important questions. So first there was this question on SME surveys, right? And the lack of data. So this is clearly an issue, but this is not just true for the informal sector. So data on firms and that's important for analytical purposes and policy analysis is limited even for the formal sector in South Asia, most of South Asia. So and it's expensive to collect data now. I should mention that the World Bank has done some surveys of the informal sector in a few countries. I'm not I don't remember off the top of my head which countries they've covered in South Asia, but there are these surveys of the informal sector, so maybe worth looking at that. One challenge that you face when trying to survey the informal sector is that there is no listing of informal firms. So, and there's very limited contact information for informal firms. So you really have to start from scratch. So you know these issues. So then people have devised ways to do it by block enumeration, almost like a household survey. It's expensive. During COVID, there were attempts to collect data through phone surveys with firms. So the World Bank did these COVID impact surveys on firms, and there they tried to cover informal firms again if they could get phone numbers, and it worked out better than expected. So these new kind of survey methods, using phones or interactive voice or using the internet might actually make a difference here. So on informality. And I think that I'm now addressing the last set of questions from gentlemen in the room. Sorry, I couldn't catch your name. But you raised really interesting points. So, some of that is a little echoing what we are saying in this volume, which is that don't necessarily think of informality as a problem, but think about how to improve productivity in the economy and address underlying constraints, and maybe a large informal sector, yes, is a kind of entry point for entrepreneurs. Another related point here, which we make in the volume, is that with these new technologies like digital platform, etc., maybe this idea that you need to be big, you need to grow and formalize to be productive, it may no longer hold true. So these new technologies may actually change the economies of scale, etc., and it may be possible to be quite productive even if you're small. So these traditional notions of large formal firms may no longer hold. That being said, there still remains to be seen, and there's not so much evidence on that. On maybe informalities as just entrepreneurs trying to testing the market. Yes, that's possibly the case, and there are many scholars of informality who have argued this case and said that the informal sector allows you flexibility, and it's actually good for entrepreneurship. That being said, in South Asia and many other developing countries, you don't see the kind of firm dynamism that you see in other economies. Like, say, if you compare India to China, firms in India are not as dynamic, meaning that they don't grow as much over time. They don't become more productive over time. They don't invest or innovate as much. So the problem again is not that necessarily that it's informality that's causing that, but there is some issue with that's some distortion or something that's preventing good entrepreneurs from growing. And on the last point about social protection for entrepreneurs, we should clarify that what we're talking about are the workers in the informal sector. So there they don't have access to the safety net, and so it's about covering workers or households, not about covering or taking away the risk from entrepreneurship, which as you argued is an incentive actually for being innovative. So I'll stop there. Mauricio, over to you.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me? No, it doesn't. No, it works. Okay. Very good. No. Again, thank you, Siddharth. Thank you for staying so long and for the interesting questions. So I'll also selectively address some. I reiterate that data is essential. It's expensive, and but it's essential to make. To guide policy design. So more data is always good, not just so we can do much better. In terms of different regimes, was another question for different types of firms or for different workers. Santiago Levy he was at Inter-American Development Bank and has worked extensively in Latin America, where there is a lot of informality as well. He was a big supporter of actually constructing a regime for informal worker to protect them, since they didn't have anything, and it was too expensive to expand the current system of the formal worker. So what a lot of countries in Latin America were stuck was a very expensive, very good social protection, pension system, insurance for the formal, mainly public government employees, and nothing for the rest. So instead of expanding this very expensive, he said, "Oh, we can design another one." But he then changed his mind because it actually sort of figure out that the incentive that he created were perverse. And so there is a lot of literature about these design of different regime for different type of workers and potentially firms. So we don't look into that in details, a little bit towards the end in the book, but yes, there is a debate there. In terms of I think there was another one on the universal basic income. I believe there was a question asked if the bank has done something. Yes, there is a large study that was done a couple of years, or maybe 3 years ago, which is called Exploring Universal Basic Income, a guide to navigating concepts, evidence, and practices. So this it looks and compare what UBI would be, how it complements other forms of social protection, and it looks at a few places where it has been experimented. And so there is a lively debate in the social protection units in the bank. And if you look in our website, you can certainly find more information on that. One maybe final point on whether I reiterate what Siddharth said, whether it's not informality per se the problem, or rather the objective should not be to reduce informality. The objective is to improve development, and our view is that most likely the idea that informality is causing hindrance to development is rather we need to understand why they exist, rather than trying to force them out or force them to pay taxes, etc. So that's a very important shift. And two more points. One is on the Kuznets story of the fact that maybe we start informal, then we become formal, then we end up again. I'm not sure that I would buy that story. I think it's more a fact that the digital economy, the digital technology has created a structural change. And indeed, it seems that is informalizing somewhat higher income countries, but it's not clear, and there's almost no study of what happens when an e-commerce platform or Uber-like starts to operate in a developing country. What we have done, for example, in Sri Lanka, and which is not a study in this volume, we have run a survey of PICME. PICME is the equivalent of Uber in Sri Lanka, and we observe that tuk-tuk, which are the ones that the three-wheelers, I don't know how you call them in Pakistan. Tuk-tuk is these three-wheelers that were all informal. Once they get onto the platform, they actually begin to behave a bit more like more formal workers than they were before. They are keeping their books, figuring out how much money they're making more precisely, opening bank accounts. Some of them are actually buying another tuk-tuk to do more business. And so it's in a developing country setting, the digital economy is not informalizing, but maybe is formalizing. And as Siddhartha had mentioned in the presentation, once they are in a platform, they also are able to, they leave a digital footprint of documentation, and then they can go to a bank and get a loan. So I'm not sure that I buy this Kuznets the story. Finally, on giving more protection, the example of Jeff Bezos starting in the garage. If you succeed, it's good. If you don't succeed, why should I protect you? Well, again, it's not that simple. And there's a very interesting study done by a PhD student that I was looking at that looks at the coverage of health insurance in the US. And there are two fundamental types. One is given by your employer, and the other one you can have from your parents. If your parents have health insurance, they can insure you as a relative. And what this study was looking at is if your insurance is via your employer, you tend to stick to that employer, because even if you are flipping burgers, if you're in a Burger King and you're not making a lot of money, you're too afraid of leaving that because you're going to lose your health insurance. Whereas if you have the health insurance from your parents, you can maybe be unemployed for some periods, look for a better job. Because even if you get sick or anything, there is a health insurance. So what the study found is that there is much better match for workers or people that have more stable health insurance that is not linked to their employment. So the design of social protection is crucial, and covering certain risks may actually create a situation where people find better match, and in better match means that they are more productive. And then overall, if you elevate this at the macro level, better match for many people means the whole economy grow faster. So there are complicated links between we're not just saying protect the vulnerable because they can't do anything else, and we have to give them something. There are linkages from protection against risk to taking risks and then becoming more productive. Okay, so I stop there. Thank you.
Basically, thank you so much for your presentation. I have 3 questions. One is related to your framework, that almost second assumption you mentioned about the homogeneity of product and labor, but actually it varies across region, countries, and even in firms. And secondly, about data, did you use any primary data in especially for your first finding? And that graph shows this after 70th quartile, the formal trend goes down and informal goes up. And thirdly, Dr. Siddharth mentioned about some scenarios like if we increase tax or some policy interventions. So did you run any simulations or give shocks to prove it or to find these scenarios? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't get the first question. Can you repeat?
Yeah, sure.
You were very fast. Sorry. For me, it's 1 in the morning, so you have to be patient with me. But can you?
In framework, you mentioned some assumption, and one of them is about homogeneity of product and labors. So do you think that labor and product is really homogeneous across regions, countries, and even firms?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yes, no, it's not. Of course not. It's just a very simplified version of reality to make a distinction of what happens when you have a distribution of first of all how we can come about a distribution of firms when of different sizes, when there are the only difference is due to productivity differences. So if we have that situation, which is modeled by several macroeconomists, what the question is, what happens when you start introducing size dependent regulation for the government? And those are that framework allows us to show what I was explaining. Now you can complicate the model, and it doesn't need that particular framework doesn't need to respect or reflect exactly the real world. And in fact, the real world is much more complicated. So it's yes. So that's the first one. The second one, you were asking about the primary data.
Simulation.
The simulation is the third one, I think. Yes. So the second one was about primary data for yes. So that graph is produced using household survey data. So we have household survey for most countries, or for all countries in South Asia. So you take a household survey, then you have to identify for each person that work, whether their work is of formal or informal nature. And there are a series of definitions. We normally go with the ILO, the International Labour Organization definition of what is formal or informal labor, and so you split the workers between labor and formal and informal workers, and then you have to make some measurement about their earnings. Once you have these two things, whether they are informal or formal, and what are their earnings, you can order them from the poorest to the richest earning, and then you take bins of 1%. And so in 1% poorest, you have 1% of the workers formal and 1% informal. How many are they? And these are the first 2 points of those 2 curves, and so on and so forth. So it's from household survey data, from what I believe you mean by primary data, right? Yes. Great. Siddharth, I'll leave you the last point, the simulation.
So I would urge you to read the paper in the book, which has a very complicated model, and one of them has kind of simulations. But in both cases, the idea was to examine the impact of a reform that had already taken place. So it's more of an ex post evaluation of reforms that have happened, and the studies use very sophisticated models to study the impact of these reforms. So I'm talking about the paper on the impact of the entry regulation and on the tax reform, right? So both papers use a model, and then they estimate that on the data, and look at the impact of the reform. So they don't really need to simulate anything, because they're actually examining the effect of an actual policy change through the lens of the model. So that's that's why it's more about like a structural estimation in these models. So yeah, that's it for me.
Any other question, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you. It's quite surprising to get such kind of presentation from the World Bank, because whenever we talk about regulations or taking people working in the informal sector to the formal sector, we talk of increasing revenues, tax base, and punitive regulations. And it's not like that we talk about protecting them. And the second thing that is also very surprising is that UBI, or living wage, that you talked about, that we need to give them non-contributory protection. Here, usually the international financial institutions, especially recently the IMF, have put a lot of pressure on the government of Pakistan to reduce its pension spending even on the public sector employees. So that is also quite surprising and good to hear. My question, however, is about that you have talked, the word development has come up in this presentation quite a lot, but you haven't talked about what kind of development we are talking about. I mean, it has been taken as a given that we are talking about something beneficial. Then I think you need to explain it a little bit, what kind of development we are talking about right now. Thank you.
It's getting deeper and deeper, the questions here. Yeah, I'm not sure I can address this in this room. Maybe we should go and have a longer coffee or a longer chat. How to define development? But I mean, there are there's a sense of leveling playing field, and I go back to what I was saying before in terms of inequality, the fact that you have had 3 decades of strong growth, but not everybody has benefited from that, and not everybody has contributed even to that is an issue. To talk about another topic that is crucial and close to what I spend a lot of time doing is, and I have here in the room quite a few female students, is inequality, gender inequality in this region. How it comes that 25% is the ratio of women participating in where normally is about 60% in the world, and men in South Asia are 85% participating. So how come that why women don't have a place in the so we can talk about many dimensions of development, but informality, it's in our view is a bit similar. Is an hidden potential. We could there could be much more participation, much more contribution to the growth process and benefit from the growth process from that. I don't know if you, Siddhartha, have anything to say, or you're ready to celebrate your birthday, perhaps. But I'll leave you the last word to you.
Thank you, Maurizio. No, I don't have much to add. That kind of deep question is probably not most conducive over Zoom, and better over coffee. So, but no, just to underline what Maurizio said very quickly, that that we didn't just consider earnings or wages in the informality in the report in this work, but also vulnerability and exposure to risk. So there is a broader notion of development embedded in our work, although it doesn't cover all the notions or all the ways in which you can think of development.
So let's conclude this. Thank you, Siddharth, especially waking at midnight. Thank you, Maurizio, for coming after a very long flight. Thank you. Thank you.